What was at stake was nothing less than the survival of the people in Western Berlin.
Suddenly, all traffic into West Berlin was stopped.
Millions of people had been displaced.
It was the beginning of the Berlin blockade.
It's hard to overstate the precarious position that Truman was in. There was a need for some sort of help.
The time for action is here now.
After World War II, there was much uncertainty about what would happen to the future of Western Europe.
The United States is vigorously following policies designed to achieve a peaceful and prosperous world.
Europe was in ruins, with widespread destruction and economies shattered.
Without help, recovery might never be achieved.
Two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union, with deep ideological differences. The Soviet Union wanted to expand communism throughout Western Europe as a buffer zone against future invasions. The United States and its allies wanted to protect democracy. This situation set the stage for the Cold War that would follow.
We believe that the United States can be an effective force for world peace only if it is strong.
The victorious powers cut Germany into 4 administrative sections. The Allies had 3 of them, the United States, Britain, and France, and Soviet Union had the 4th. Berlin itself was cut into 2, with the Allies on West Berlin side and Soviet Union on East Berlin. After World War II, millions of people had been displaced. People were hungry. There was a need for some sort of help.
The thing we did then was to set up in every country a program known as the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan was a massive program of aid to Western Europe on the part of the Allies, but the Soviet Union saw it as a threat to them. So they wanted to extend their power into Eastern Europe as a result and as a retaliation. And that's where the problem with Berlin began.
Already an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria.
What the Soviet Union did was they cut off all canals and highways and railroads into Western Berlin, even cut off all electricity as a way of extending their control into Western Berlin. It's hard to overstate the precarious position that Truman was in. On the one hand, if he abandoned Berlin, it would be humiliating for the United States, but even more importantly, it would mean that there'd be no help for 2.5 million people living in West Berlin. What was at stake was nothing less than the survival of the people in Western Berlin. Truman had to make a critical decision.
The world can move out of the shadows of fear and war and into the light of freedom and peace.
Truman had basically 3 options. He could abandon Berlin, but it would be done at a price of credibility for the United States, or he could have a full-scale invasion, but that would be done at a risk of a much larger war. Or he had a third choice, which was to have an airlift to bring the supplies into Berlin itself.
Although the Free Berliners were resolved not to yield to Soviet pressure, the outlook was dark.
Amazingly, only 2 days after the blockade had begun, Truman made the decision that there would not be an invasion, there would not be armed forces, there would be instead an airlift, a bold but peaceful decision. On June 26, the first planes started to go in, incredibly. A small cargo plane with only a limited amount of supplies. Tensions were incredibly high. They had no idea whether it would be able to cross over into Western Berlin.
Planes are under constant surveillance by Soviet fighters.
They weren't sure whether or not they would be shot down. But the plane made it, and Truman had made the decision then, we are staying in Berlin, period. And then the true airlift began at that point. One plane after another, after another, after another.
Russia wanted the Allies out of Berlin, but Operation Vittles had other ideas.
And always on the minds of all the people involved in the airlift was the recognition that if it failed, and it could very well fail, then there would be starvation in Western Europe. An incredibly courageous decision. The airlift is such a forward and bold decision, in part because of the circumstances. The planes, they had a very narrow corridor in which they had to fly, always on the edge of the Soviet-owned airspace. If they strayed into Soviet territory by mistake, the plane could be shot down, bringing upon a much wider war. The execution had to be almost perfect. and what they had to do, since one plane was flying right after another. They had to drop the equipment off and get up immediately, because then other planes were going to come and they could collide. So the amount of space was limited and the amount of time they had to drop the supplies was limited. 1,500 planes going every day, going every 30 seconds, dropping the supplies, getting back in the air, and then coming back again and again and again. Incredible.
Our country was proud of its Air Force on a mission of mercy and international significance.
There were 277,000 flights that were flown, delivering 2.3 million tons. And think of it, there were 2.5 million people in West Berlin, which means it's almost a ton per person of food and fuel and coal and clothing and supplies. It's an extraordinary, astonishing thing they did. It's hard to imagine how much it must have meant to the people in Berlin. There was hope, there were friends, there were allies on the outside. It gave them hope for a future that would be different from the terrible present that they were experiencing. One of my favorite stories about the Berlin airlift is the story of the candy bombers. Little parachutes were made of handkerchiefs with gum and candy in them, dropped from the plane for the kids. Back in America, newspapers and radios and churches encouraged participation in the efforts to bring together the clothing and the food and the baby formula and, of course, the candy. And at the same time, schools encouraged letter-writing campaigns so that school kids in America could write to their counterparts in West Berlin. And a huge number of letters were exchanged on both sides.
The courageous airlift had snatched West Berlin from the claws of the Russian band.
After 11 months, it broke the Soviet blockade. It was humiliating for them. It was a great victory for the Western Allies.
The free world had called Russia's bluff.
But the tensions between the East and the West would continue.
It is a victory taken with caution by the Western democracies as Russia gives ground in the Cold War.
But the airlift demonstrated the resolve of the West. It demonstrated that the United States was committed to defending Western Europe. It led to the formation of NATO. It showed a moral victory, and it showed Truman's decisiveness.
The Russians had an idea that they'd force us to leave. Instead of that, the Berlin became a symbol of what the Allies were trying to do, and the resolution became stronger and stronger.
The impact of the airlift was simply astonishing. It saved lives. It was a political success, the first real success in many ways in the Cold War. On Truman's desk, there was a sign that I loved that said, "The buck stops here." It meant that he bore ultimate responsibility for a decision. No blame, no excuses for anyone else. He would take that responsibility. And as a result, the success of the Berlin airlift showed that combination of firm leadership and moral clarity. And I think Truman established himself in the minds of many people at that time as that kind of leader. After so many years of FDR, this was Truman's moment.